What in the world is going on here? Well, we have a mess. That's pretty obvious. Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm sure you see right away we have the Micro Monster truck completely torn apart here. The last time you seen this truck, we went through and tuned that ESC to get the Furitek system to give me a little bit less power so I wasn't breaking anything, and yet we still broke things. I broke some drive shafts, so I ordered some steel ones to take care of that, but we'll get to that in a minute. I also wanted to experiment with some different shocks, so I bought a set of shocks, but we'll get to that in a minute as well. Something I noticed though was the actual axles themselves. I don't know how well you can see that here. I might have to get a close-up shot. But the drive shafts inside of the axles, the pins that go into the cups, are just shaving completely off. It's still too much power, and they're just not strong enough. The Devastator axles are not strong enough for this power, which I really wanted it to work, but it doesn't. Started looking into my options and decided I'm gonna try an SCX24 axle. The reason being is I'm hoping that maybe I can redesign this chassis to fit completely around SCX24 parts. That way people aren't buying multiple trucks, multiple parts to be able to build one. I know before, when I originally designed this truck, it started out with the Devastator. That way I could have front and rear steer, but I used an SCX24 transmission. So you'd have to buy a Devastator plus that transmission, and I kind of want to get rid of all that. If you want to go all out and end up getting one of these Furitek systems and everything, that's great. But if you wanted to stay on the cheap end, you could just buy a SCX24, print the chassis, and play around like that and have some fun. So I've been redesigning some parts. I redesigned the motor plate to accept the SCX24 axles. The links on the Devastator actually bolted from the outside of the chassis, and these are going to bolt on the inside of the chassis between the chassis plates and the motor mount. So that had to be modified a little. I'm going to go ahead and screw the Furitek transmission back to the motor plate so I can install it in the truck. So that part was pretty straightforward. Now we need our SCX24 axles. I went with 2 front axles, that way I could get front and rear steer again, but you could always use just the SCX24 axles that came on the truck and just have front steer if you'd like. Only other thing you'd need is a set of links, because as you can see, I'm using the front links, front and rear. That'll set my wheelbase right. Actually, the SCX24 front links were the same length basically as the Devastator links. So now those are just going to screw into the bottom of the chassis just like they would on the SCX24. And because I don't have the actual screws that the SCX24 would have came with, I'm using some different screws here, some longer ones, but you would use the ones that came on the truck. Now we just got to secure those upper links. You could see that I used the wishbone style. I feel like this will give me a little better or less torque twist, hopefully anyway, we'll see. And it was a simple install. I just printed up some little spacers that'll go in between the wishbone, and the screws will pass straight through it and into the spacer. The rear one I had to notch a little bit. I cut this one with an X-Acto knife, but I'll end up modeling it right for the files. And this just slides inside of there and screws in with the SCX24 screws. So now with my truck, I had made some brackets to mount the servo onto the chassis, get it off of the axle. You could leave the servos on the axle if you wanted with the SCX24. I'm gonna leave them on the axle because the servos I have are actually bigger than the SCX24 servos. So now I need to figure out what to do with this bracket. I could go ahead and buy some brackets to mount the links from the rear axle, but since I got these already, I think I'm just gonna pull these brackets off and cut the servo mount off of them. Shouldn't be a big deal, and it should give us a little more travel, probably about a 1/4 inch or so, and we'll be good to go. We can add the shocks and the drive shafts after that. I'm sure you'll see I already have the back done, but for shocks, we went with some telescoping extended shocks for the SCX24. These are very similar to the hot racing ones that I actually put on my SCX24. These just come off of Amazon. They were a little cheaper. I'll leave a link down below to those, as well as the drive shafts, which also came from Amazon, that we'll get to in a minute. What I do want to do first is replace these springs. It came with an assortment of springs. I want to put the stiffer silver springs on. It's the same thing I did in the rear, just to hopefully handle the weight of the truck a little better. The other thing I had to do was remove the pivot ball from the top of the shocks. These are SCX24 shocks, as I said, so they use these really tiny screws. I designed this chassis for the Devastator shocks originally, and they used a little bit of a bigger screw. I actually think they used a ball stud that I replaced with a bigger screw, so these mounting holes for my shocks are too big for these tiny screws. What I'm using in place, because I can't just stick the screw in, I'm using these little washer spacer things that you get with a servo, and it actually fits perfectly inside the hole of the shock, and my screw sits perfect inside of it like that. I'm sure you noticed I already had the steering figured out. It is a little loose, but we're gonna see once everything's mounted on the truck and we're running. Last thing to do is drive shafts, and I already have the rear one in. You can see it's marked though. I have to cut these. So I'm using SCX24 shafts as well, and when you buy SCX24 shafts, the front one's shorter than the rear one. But I figured out that I could just take the rear shaft and the front shaft and kind of mix match them together to get the length that I need. The only issue with that, like I said, is now this is too long, so I'm gonna have to cut it. I'm gonna have to do the same thing with the front. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these to shorten them up to what I need, and we'll install them, get the tires back on, and should be able to test this thing out, I believe. With the wheels and tires back on, now all there's left to do is test it out. There's only one thing I really had to do. I ended up putting an O-ring on the bottom of both of these ball studs for the steering linkages, front and rear, and all that did was stop the steering linkage from swaying up and down so much. I found that was kind of throwing my steering out of whack. Now, I know gearing wise with these axles is way different, so I'm gonna have to go into the Furitek app again and turn the power back up. These steel drive shafts should do the trick though. We shouldn't have any more trouble with breaking that, so let's see how different this truck is now. Well, this is definitely not what I expected. Steel drive shafts, and well, I didn't break a drive shaft, but the screw that holds the drive shaft onto the axle or transmission actually snapped. And the funny thing is, I even have an extra one because the kit came with an extra one. Where it snapped at, I can't get that little nub out of there, so I can't put another one in. Simple enough to just order another set. Like I said, they came from Amazon, should be here quickly, but that'll stop me for the day. I will say, even in that quick running footage, you probably noticed it's a good bit slower than it was before. And that's with the power turned up a bit actually. High start power, 100% throttle, and a little bit of throttle punch in there. But even though it's a little slower, I actually think that's a good thing. It feels more scale, it feels more controllable and not wild. We may not get that super big air anymore, but it just feels better. It feels like I'm more in control of the truck. You could maybe even see on one of those jumps, I can almost pull an endo or a stoppie, moonwalk, whatever you want to call it. That'll definitely take some throttle control to do, but it looks like we'll be able to do that. I did attempt one backflip and wasn't too successful, but I still have a little more throttle punch that I can add in with the Furitek ESC. So maybe if I add in some more punch, I'll be able to get that full rotation. That's all I'm looking for really. Once I can do that, I feel like it's perfect enough power. Other than that, the only thing I would say, if you can avoid it, I wouldn't put the servos on the chassis. I would leave the servos on the axle, just because as the suspension moves up and down, you can already see it right there, that steering linkage moves, and that kind of messes with the steering a little bit. It's not always 100% accurate, and it's kind of wonky, but not too bad. So now, just gotta get some more drive shafts in, fix that problem, and I can get back to having fun with it. I think the only thing we need now is another one so we can do some racing and freestyle competitions. That's right, the guys at Furitek contacted me about trying this thing out. This is their Rampart aluminum micro monster truck. Pretty sure this is enduro axles. Looks like the same transmission and motor that I have in my truck. We're gonna go over this thing in its own video, but just wanted to give y'all a little teaser on this. We're gonna build this thing out, maybe figure out a new body style, whatever for this, and we'll definitely compare it with my truck. But I'm definitely excited to get started on this thing. I have an ESC coming already, and I'm looking for some tires to maybe 3D print a different set of wheels. So hopefully you'll see that soon. Make sure to subscribe if you're interested and are loving the micro monster truck action. There's plenty more to come. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. It helps out a ton. And as always, thanks again for watching. Peace.